Hey guys, I don't know if you managed to listen to the latest episode of Bournemouth Backchat. That's the podcast that I produce and present for HQB, my old job. It was actually our 50th episode this week, and it contains a segment wherein I reveal the winner of a story writing challenge between my two co-presenters, Aaron and James. James Boxall won the challenge with a short story called Rat. And in lieu of a prize, I'm actually going to read that story for you now. So here it is, Rat by James Boxall.
Hunger dictated a hunt. The mammoth meat had lasted a few days, a welcome change from the usual scraps gathered. He didn't want to leave the relatively warm embrace of the cave, but he didn't really have a choice. When there's only one thing to do it, he muttered, as he grudgingly grabbed a sharp stick left resting near the wall. He was pessimistic of finding anything good, as disappointment often followed a fruitful few days. He always seemed to find enough to get by, however. He would not still be here if he didn't. He stepped out into the light of the tundra. The crisp bite of the morning pierced his skin. The cold was all he felt these days. In the past there had been fear, regret, and loneliness. All that had been frozen out now. Where he had been haunted by his past before, the ghosts were now silent. He had forgotten the sound of laughter and the comfort of body heat. His life trimmed back into a simple cycle of tasks to ensure he would wake up each morning. The frigid expanse lay out before him. A trip out in the steppe wouldn't last long if the traps had done their job, though if past history were anything to go by, it was unlikely. A few cages had been scattered out in the area under his mountain. Hopefully he could pick up a rabbit or two whose curiosity had got the better of them, then maybe sort out some hydration on the way back. The novelty of the hunt had worn off ages ago, morphing into a monotonous ritual once he realized nothing out here could harm him, other than himself. On autopilot, he'd wandered down the valley towards the first trap. He'd got lucky with the leftover mammoth meat, just needing to scare off a couple of foxes for it. A caged rabbit was far more common, simple enough to finish with a couple of jabs of the stick. Foxes were too large to capture, agile enough to dodge a makeshift arrow. Arrows were for the deer, though it often took several to take one down. He'd only nabbed a couple in his time here. If he was honest with himself, he was surprised how poor a hunter he turned out to be. Possibly one time aside, he'd never seen anything living out here besides his staple prey. Even the mammoths were found dead on his arrival. The possible exception came on one of his first hunts out of the mountain cave, and he wasn't even sure it had happened. That time he had ventured out into the wilderness early one night, having failed on several daytime hunts. The sky was glowing under the aurora, 1,000 lights from shooting stars and spaceships twinkling behind it in the night sky. He was unfamiliar with the area back then, not really knowing what to search for. As he got more and more desperate, a small fungal growth he'd found by a rock got more and more attractive. He'd plucked a small mushroom and forced it down, nearly gagging on the earthy taste. After a few minutes forcing food down, he started feeling strange. The colours of the night sky glowed brighter, and his head felt heavy. He'd slumped down by the stone, drifting in and out of consciousness. It was at that point he could have sworn he saw a blurry being come over to his slouched body as his tired eyes overcame him. And then he'd woken up. Whether mirage or man, that was the closest to proper contact he'd had. He hadn't managed to bottle up his loneliness and lust for human contact at that point, and spent several days investigating the nearby area for the shadowy creature. Alas, no trace of a living being, unlike the trap today. The spring mechanism had sprung, and it looked like he might be eating today. Or perhaps not, as he examined a bit closer. A bit smaller than the usual catch, with a pointy nose and a long, wormy tail, the creature wouldn't stay still. A rat, he thought. That's new. He didn't feel that desperate yet, though that may have been because he was gorging on mammoth meat recently. He released the rodent and reset the trap, hoping something better would pay it a visit next time. The other traps proved even more fruitless. Each one was untouched by the local wildlife. After half a week, under normal circumstances, he would have thought at least one rabbit would have wandered in, but there was nothing. He didn't panic. Like night followed day, he seemed to cycle between good days and bad for food. He had realized he hadn't seen anything moving out in the wild today, which was peculiar. The air was silent. It hit home how alone he was. He'd considered repositioning some of the mechanisms, but couldn't muster the effort. There seemed little point. The traps would no doubt catch something tomorrow, as if by magic, if he felt hungry enough. This had happened too many times before, nearly every time these days. He knew no way to break the cycle unless he decided to listen to the dark voices in the back of his head. They had been getting louder over the last week. He had started coming to accept that it may be the only thing to do. Even when he had easy access to the mammoth meat, it just took away one task from his day and left him more alone time with his thoughts. His doubts about heading out today vindicated, he trundled back towards the mountain so he could waste away another day sleeping. His head bowed, it only tilted up to make sure he was heading the most direct route. It was then he spotted something sticking out of a nearby bush. The eyes stared at him from within it, the leaves masking a pale white face. Female, he thought. The shock startled him initially, though he soon realized she was not breathing. The body was almost completely concealed, laying stiller than the morning air. He could see why he had not seen her there before, though was surprised the foxes hadn't had a go. She was probably a bit too old for him to have a go. He unceremoniously dragged the corpse out of the bush by the arm that was already slightly poking out. His thoughts turned quickly to if she had had anything useful on her. Money wouldn't be useful, but perhaps some sort of communication device he could use. Rummaging in her pockets, he found a small black electronic device. The first thing that struck him was there was no solar panel built into the device to keep it charged. It looked like some sort of primitive device they had had hundreds of thousands of years ago, heavy and clunky. That sent alarm bells ringing, as the device wouldn't be on the network. The corpse hadn't decayed that much, though. This wasn't some ancient archaeological discovery. That could only mean she had been here when they had come. She must have died for him. An innocent life wiped down. How many millions of intelligent life forms have been terminated for this brave new world? He wanted to listen to his dark desires. He wanted no more part of this. He couldn't give them any justification for this barbaric demonstration. He wasn't sure if he were angry or calm, because now he knew how he could be liberated. A tree branch and the bowstring should do it. Hubert gazed at the planet, and it looked back from 1,000 miles away, blue and green with frosted tips on the poles. They had sped up the planet's rotation to measure the experience of days gliding by. He could swear he could see it spinning before his eyes. The land was so empty, experiments cordoned off onto continents in case any of them got too adventurous. A lonely planet. His northern subject today had declined the new food introduced to him. The research team hoped they could measure how long it would take to transition to rodents worming him off the rabbits. The data would have proven useful to the Empire in measuring nutritional limits. The unexpected stimuli encountered today had nearly voided the trial. Vital signs had been good, but now the control panel was flashing, the microchip picking something up. Something from the brain. Suicidal thoughts, perhaps, based on the dopamine concentration. It was amazing how the biochemical data accumulated over the years could accurately predict these things. The levels had been slowly building up for a while, but something had just accelerated it and pushed it dangerously over the average suicide level detected in past trials. Hubert had had to send someone down in the past when this one had eaten some poisonous mushrooms in the woods, but now it looked like he might try something deliberate. 74% of the subjects who had hit this point had tried the bowstring, so by now the program always made sure a potential noose could not hold a subject's weight. Still, It would be for the best to teleport someone down there now to stop them hurting himself. They could pick up the girl's body while they were at it. Though they had always made sure the bodies of the local inhabitants had been cleaned up, one had clearly fallen through the cracks here. Normally drones would be dispatched to scan an area for unregistered life forms after a cleansing pulse had been fired. It should have just been rabbits, foxes and deer here at the start. The rat parameter was to be introduced later for the experiment. The young alien's corpse must have cooled rapidly due to the environment for it not to be picked up by the scanners. This planet had been a distant rock on the edge of the Empire's domain. Basic inhabitants had already evolved there to a moderate level, though the Empire's citizens had come to accept planets getting wiped for the experiments on prisoners. The results these tests had collected proved very useful for keeping order in the galaxy. Besides, anyone who had read about this particular subject in the press knew he deserved to be shut away for what he'd done to those kids, even if it meant culling a few minor aliens. Hubert made a note to tell the clean-up crew to take away the weapons while down there. The traps still in the cave would have to go too. Couldn't have him hurting himself by dismantling the wire. Inject him with some dopamine to bring his mood back. Protocol was to move the trial to the final stage after the test subject hit a breaking point. Knock them out and move the unconscious body back to the cave and seal it up with a heavy rockfall. Leave a fire running for light and for cooking, though he could always join the 10% who tried to use it as an out. Fewer than 200 subjects so far had succeeded with self-immolation. If not, the scientists would at least get good data about how long it takes for someone to move to rat. He slowly came around in the darkness. The string must have snapped under his weight. How had he ended up back in the cave, though? It was dark, bar the glow of the fire. He must have been out for hours. He heard a rodent scurry in the background.